Actually, the first classes are already posted on YouTube on the Amandla African Samaj. And you can see them in English, in French, in Portuguese. You can listen to this class in any of these languages due to our very dedicated interpreter volunteers by clicking on the globe icon and choosing your language. So far, 142 people have registered. They're from 12 countries of Africa and 21 other countries. The 25 speakers of this course also come from many different countries of Africa and the world. Today is class number 7, entitled From Capitalist Globalization to Universal Family, Pathways for Africa. Our speaker today is Dada Ravi Shekharananda. Dada Ravi Shekharananda has been a yogic monk and yoga teacher in the inner world for 24 years. He's also a social activist who believes that humanity is undergoing a change of historical consciousness. He's presently based in the Middle East in Cairo sector. Dada Ravi Shekharananda, namaskar, and please begin.
Namaskar, Dada Maheshwarananda ji. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you to Guru Vati and the team for organizing this and for the invitation to participate. I'd like to share the screen. Can we just set that up, please? So,
go ahead.
Okay. How's that looking?
It's all right, but can you put it into slide show mode?
Okay. All right, for anyone interested, here is some contact information for me. There's also the proudglobe.org website. You can reach me on the email address there and the phone number, the WhatsApp number also. Okay, so from capitalist globalization to universal family, pathways for Africa. Of course, it's a huge presumption on my part to really be here talking about Africa. I've had extremely little contact other than in the north of Africa, in Egypt, where I do go time to time with my work. However, I am, educated on the principles and teachings of progressive utilization theory. So this is an effort to use that Prout framework to give an analysis, firstly, of the state of capitalist globalization in the world, and a future beyond that we've here articulated as universal family. So I need to pause for the translation, is that correct? Hello?
You're going fine.
So I don't have to stop for translation, is that right?
No, just go slowly, and that would be
slowly.
Perfect.
Okay.
It would be perfect if you talk slowly. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I hope that people can take something of use and value from the presentation. Okay, so this is my effort at mapping out a broad historical framework. Of course, there was a very long pre-colonial. Sorry?
Dada, excuse me. Probably it's best if you pause after each sentence. A little bit, just a little bit. Because it's so easy to talk quickly.
Okay, thank you, Dada.
Maisharanji, it seems the translation in Portuguese coming from the English side, and his speech in Portuguese coming in English coming on the Portuguese side. Just if you can inform.
I'm sorry, what are you saying?
The translation in Portuguese is coming in the English side. When you open the English, you hear in Portuguese. And when you listen to Dada, you hear him from the Portuguese side.
Amitabha, it says English to Spanish. Victoria, it says English to Portuguese. I don't understand the problem, Dada.
Okay then.
It says Guruvati, English to French. Dada?
Okay, carrying on.
Okay.
Of course, there's a very long. So there's a very long pre-colonial history that the African people and nations have. And then, of course, there's a very brutal period of colonial history. And that's, we could talk a long time just about that and, the origins of that chapter in human history. And we're not going to get the chance to do that, but obviously it's important to place the contemporary moment in that broader colonial framework, because the impact is obviously still present. And from that colonial history, it then passed on into a neo-colonial history, which we're hearing a lot about today, literally in these past weeks with the events in Niger. And then there is what we may call a post-colonial history that we might distinguish from a neo-colonial history. And that post-colonial path of development has, from what I can see, orientated around a capitalist model of development or a state capitalist model of development in the case of several African nations. I think Ghana was one example, and Algeria another, where it was a type of African socialist experiment with the state having considerable ownership of industries. And then the question mark there is representing the future. Where do we go from here? What are the options for Africa as it moves into the future? Okay. In terms of the post-colonial history, the 1960s and 70s were important times in that period, this period of independence, either in a neo-colonialist framework or in this post-colonial framework, and characterized by initial social and economic development following independence. Of course, heavy borrowing and what was referred to as the import substitution industrialization, ISI, where many nations opted to industrialize in the areas of what they had been importing, those especially essential things. So that was an effort to produce locally what was previously being imported. And then on into the 1980s, a national debt crisis became widespread. And then, of course, the participation of the International Monetary Fund and their structural adjustment programs, often what we call conditionality. In order to get those loans, various policies had to be implemented, such as removal of food subsidies, liberalization of trade, enforcing a balanced budget, and a freeze on wage increases. And the outcome of this was often to increase unemployment, a rural exodus to the cities, and indeed a fall in living standards. In terms of the International Monetary Fund's role and the World Bank, they were two institutions that are sometimes referred to as Bretton Woods institutions. And Bretton Woods was a conference of many nations in 1944 at the end of the war, World War II. And it was really setting up a new global financial system. And these two institutions, of course, went on to play major roles in Africa. There's various other initiatives, the New Partnership for Africa's Development, referred to as NEPAD, characterized by a market economy, emphasizing this sort of capitalist free market economy, and a neoliberal approach. Contrasting against that, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa seemed to emphasize more industrialization and a greater role of the state. So these were two sort of contrasting outside approaches. One was this more neoliberal, and the other was this increased role of the state. Okay, I think I'm going to jump that.
Okay. Aduma. I can.
So we had the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and on this other side, we had the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. And that was the one emphasizing the greater role of the state, industrialization, and was picked up by Ghana and Algeria particularly. There were various other initiatives launched, COMESA, the Common Market of Eastern and Southern Africa. You can see on this graphic here, extending from the north as far south as Zimbabwe and Madagascar. Much more recent, in fact, within the last month actually, there was the Russia-African Summit in St. Petersburg. I think many people will be familiar with that. And that was another effort at addressing Pan-African development around industry, infrastructure, engineering, agriculture. In relation to that, Africa has a huge trade imbalance with Russia. They import 5 times more than what they export to Russia, so that's a major trade imbalance. Positive news, you may not have heard of this, but there was a write-down of the debt to Russia up to as high as $23 billion. Interestingly, not much reported in the mainstream media, at least in the Western countries. Okay, so that's sort of just a very broad overview of some of these initiatives that have been launched for the development of Africa and its economies. And we're going to contrast that with some other ideas in a minute. However, I'd like now to move into just giving a picture of what I see to be the status of capitalist globalization today. So we're going to just take a few minutes to look at what this capitalist project of globalization has arrived at today, and possibly where it may be heading. So here's a rally. There's a big sign there: capitalism isn't working. Democracy is an illusion. And I think this somehow indicates some of the crises facing global capitalism and particularly the Western-led capitalist system. Here's a quotation from Chris Hedges. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author. And he's making this comment in relation to the state of the United States of America. So, quote, "We now live in a nation where doctors destroy health, lawyers destroy justice, universities destroy knowledge, governments destroy freedom, the press destroys information, religion destroys morals, and our banks destroy the economy." I think this is more than just a comment on the United States. I think it's a comment on many Western capitalist nations. And it shows the depth of the emerging crisis in the capitalist nations. This is a pretty damning indictment of the socioeconomic system of capitalism. Here is a quotation from a former US National Security Advisor. Quote, "The technotronic era involves the gradual appearance of a more controlled society. Such a society would be dominated by an elite, unrestrained by traditional values. Soon it will be possible to assert almost continuous surveillance over every citizen." And I think this quotation gives another perspective of what's going on in Western capitalism. So it's here emphasizing the surveillance society. And that's definitely something we in the Western countries are living with constantly, whether it's online or walking down a street. Surveillance is a daily reality. This is a quotation from a leader, Yanis Varoufakis. Some of you may know him as the previous finance minister of Greece. Quote, "We have an oligarchy with elections, and the elections are bought by the oligarchy." Oligarchy is meaning rule by the few, rule by elites. And he's, of course, talking about the advanced capitalist nations and making the claim they are ruled by an oligarchy, a small elite and that elite buys the elections, and thereby democracy has been completely undermined. He's the author of a book titled Techno-Feudalism. In his analysis, advanced capitalism, which is what is driving capitalist globalization, can be described as techno-feudal in its nature. And again, feudalism, the pre-capitalist system that dominated many parts of the world, where again, a very small elite, whether clerics in the form of priests and religions dominating as a small elite, or kings and monarchs. And then the large remainder of the society were really serfs. There was, of course, nobility there as a sort of interface between the oligarchy at the top and the serfs at the bottom. And of course, serfs didn't own anything. So he's making this comment about advanced capitalism. It's actually moving towards a feudalist system that is supported by technology. And we remember again that quotation earlier of the technotronic era and the surveillance society. Okay, so this is, again, giving a viewpoint about what is the state of the so-called advanced capitalist nations today. From The Guardian in the UK newspaper, 2018, richest 1% on target to own 2/3 of all wealth by 2030. Absolutely mind-boggling. So as we look at the enormous concentration of wealth into a tiny, tiny number of hands, a tiny portion of the world population. And this apparatus, or this oligarchy, this elite that is behind the movement towards a highly controlled society in the advanced form of capitalism, works through a number of organizations and institutions. One is, of course, finance, and particularly international finance, and particularly the practice of lending money to nations, very often where those nations will be completely incapable of paying back those loans. So control of finance and ultimately world finance. Intelligence is referring to intelligence agencies, the intelligence apparatus, and the role again of controlling the society, surveilling the population. And of course, the military is there. The military is there enforcing the, let's say, this approach to social management. Industry, the controlling of industry, of course, through the form of transnational corporations. So that is definitely an ongoing trend where industry in our local nations are increasingly controlled through transnational corporations. The governmental apparatus, the comment earlier was that elections of governments have now been compromised, where the financial class is able to use their financial resources to influence the outcome of elections and therefore who we get as governments. Transnationals are there again, transnational corporations, and then organizations. And these include the big foundations, often presented as philanthropic foundations of literally of billionaires or of dynastic families, and a multitude of other organizations that all connect in that inner point of this circle, representing the interests of international capital and the financial elite that is at the center of that. This is a diagram that gives an analysis of what's happening in terms of globalization, whereby at the top portion of this diagram, we have these elites, we have these oligarchies, the financial elites. We have the fraternities that they meet in and work through. And then beneath that, there is a layer there, if you can see the diagram, it's titled World Financial Control. And we see these different bodies there, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, two Bretton Woods institutions, and these big central banks. And they are there controlling tax revenue, central banks, interest revenues, and this central bank of central banks, known as the Bank of International Settlements. So there's this layer of world financial control. Beneath that, there is another layer here, and it's titled World Resource Control Corporations. So again, the corporation, which here means transnational corporations, are the vehicle for the control of world resources. And you can see the names of some of those corporations listed there. The next layer is titled World Population Control. And this includes politics and governments. It includes the military, the police, courts, and prisons. It includes the mass media, the education system, and religion. We can say beliefs and religion. So from this perspective, it's categorizing all of population control. And right at the bottom, we have population resource labor units. So they're the labor force, the mass of humanity. So that's again giving state of where capitalist globalization has arrived at today. And it's a very, very disturbing picture here of a social and economic system very much centered around control of resources, control of finance, control of our world populations down to the nation state level. And I think it's important for us to consider these types of interpretations. Because it wakes up to the idea that while political, social, economic power remains in the hands of a financial or merchant or capitalist elite, then it's likely that the movement will be towards entrenching the power of that elite or that superclass. Here is a picture of a politician, a South African politician, Julius Malema. I think many of you will be knowing this person. Why I've put him here is because I think to a great extent he understands what was going on in this brief appraisal of the state of advanced capitalism today. He's made a number of public statements that indicate he is actually aware of what's going on in this project of capitalist globalization. He's considered to be a far-left politician, a president of the African National Congress Youth League, leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters since 2013, and an MP in the National Assembly of South Africa 2014 till 22. However, if you listen to some of his public speeches and interviews, he makes some very, very disturbing statements. And on one particular interview, he made the statement that at the moment, we are not considering killing white South Africans. And I wanted to put that in there to indicate that simply because a politician may have a very deep and revealing analysis of what's going on in terms of the capitalist system and its agenda in Africa, it doesn't mean that that person would make a good leader, a benevolent leader. And I just use him as one small example. Now, what the status of the recent coup in Niger, of course it was a military coup. Some people are calling it a revolution. But the mere fact that a group may succeed in taking political power, of course, it doesn't mean that power will be used judiciously for the welfare of the people. And we will address that issue in much more detail as we proceed. So the question that things meant to be doing, what is our real human purpose? And I hope you can see the connection between that question and this topic of society, economy, and the liberation of human society. Because if we genuinely want a proper human society, we've got to ask the question, what is our actual purpose as human beings? And from the perspective of yoga, which is what my background is, the answer to that question lies with the word dharma. Dharma. And the word dharma means the fundamental characteristic of an object. So we can talk about what is human dharma. A simple example actually we often use is what is the dharma of fire? The dharma of fire is to burn. Characteristic is to burn. If it doesn't burn, it's not fire. So we then ask the question, what is human dharma? What is human purpose? What are the fundamental characteristics of human beings? And again, drawing on this yogic perspective, we find it is quadridimensional. It has four aspects to it. One, human beings want to expand their mind. So expansion, one characteristic of human beings. Two, flow. Human beings want to come into a flow that is higher than their own ego, their own individual self. So it's this idea of flow. Sometimes people today use the word zone, being in the zone. So we have this idea of flow, bringing our mind into this higher flow, into this universal flow. Three, selfless service. Human beings want to give selfless service, and they can give selfless service. Number four, ultimately, human beings want spiritual emancipation. To become one ultimately with the source from which they come. These are considered to be the four fundamental characteristics of human beings. Drawing on the wisdom of the ancient mystics. They did not invent Dharma, they merely discovered it. Dharma existed prior to human beings. So we see again these four aspects of Dharma: expansion of mind, coming in this higher flow, selfless service, spiritual emancipation. And in this way, human beings are able to develop themselves at the physical level, at the emotional level, at the mental level, and ultimately at the spiritual level, the level of our deepest inner pure state of consciousness. So this is the answer to the question, what is human purpose? What are we here for? And if we can answer that question, then we have a possibility of creating a society that is in line with that deep human purpose. If we can't answer the question, what is human purpose, then the chance of our creating a society that fulfills that human purpose, of course, will be very small. So from this viewpoint, this part is very important, to have clear understanding of what our human purpose is, and then using that to guide how we create a proper human society. So we had this pre-colonial phase in African history. We had the colonial phase. We had this neo-colonial phase, which we're hearing about so much today, often in relation to France. We have this post-colonial phase, largely capitalist in its nature, and occasionally state capitalist in the case of the African socialist type model that some countries pursued. And then we come to a future possibility of a very different social and economic system, one that would be cooperative led and what we call a three-tier economy that would be self-sufficient with the guaranteed minimum requirements. And that's the system that advocates that, of course, is progressive utilization theory, or PROUT. So we're going to look a little bit at what PROUT will be and what this Proutist model represents, what it stands for, and presenting that as another pathway of development, as an important preferred pathway, in my opinion. And this is, of course, not restricted only to African socioeconomic futures, but literally globally. Because all countries today, to a greater or lesser extent, are at that capitalist or state capitalist level of development, have pursued the capitalist or state capitalist model of social and economic development and created enormous problems, some of which we touched on earlier in that appraisal of capitalist globalization. So let us continue. I want to touch on the social dynamics of the progressive utilization theory, or of PROUT. So we're just going to explore briefly. I think this provides a fantastic model of analysis for societies. According to PROUT, human beings can be divided into one of four social psychologies: that of the laborer, the manual laborer, that of the warrior, that of the intellectual, that of the merchant. We may possess more than one of them, but generally one of those four predominates in any individual. And it's not only individuals. The point comes where three out of those four social psychologies will aggregate together, will form a collective in the society, and ultimately one of those three will come to dominate the society or rule the society. Now, those three are the warrior, the intellectual, and the merchant. So we can analyze human history in its totality and see that any particular part of that human history was dominated by one of these four psychologies. There was a very long period where the laborer psychology ruled the ancient human society. We may assume that went on literally for hundreds of thousands of years. And then we see the rise of a warrior class that eventually rose and came to dominate the society. And eventually that phase lasted also a very long time in human history, where warriors were dominating the society. They were warrior societies. And in a more recent phase of human history, there came the time where intellectuals rose and power passed from warriors to intellectuals. And again, in the context of modern human history, we see the transition from the society dominated by intellectuals, in fact, usually in the form of priests and religions. And we finally saw power pass to the merchant social psychology. So this framework provides a very nice way of understanding our human history. And we can look at any particular country in terms of when these four groups ruled. And we may ask the question, indeed, which social psychology dominates today? In fact, we'll ask that question shortly. So this social cycle, as it's referred to, has three parts to it. There is the phase of development, the rising of that society, let's say the rise of the warrior society. It reaches a point of pause in its development, and then it goes into a phase of decline, of degeneration, of retardation, characterized by exploitation of the mass of the society. And it's good, again, this provides a nice analytic tool to look again at any given society and to assess, are they in the benevolent phase, in the rising phase, are they at a pause point, or indeed are they in the phase of degeneration? Graphically, we may depict it as that. The rising phase is, on average, is beneficial to the society, is more positive than negative. It's not to say that it's all positive by any means, but the positives outweigh the negatives as that new social psychology or social order rises. And then when it moves into pause and then finally into retardation or degeneration, it has a negative impact on the society and on the welfare of the people of the society. This is representing the dominance of negative tendencies in the society, negative forces, negative agendas, translated into negative policies of governments. Negative, or we may say misplaced or ignorant social and economic policies. And here would represent positive innovations, progressive innovations in a society. It's not to say there aren't negatives. We see here on the right side there are negative aspects, but they are outweighed by the positive. So that would correlate with this positive rising of the society. So according to the social dynamics of Prout and the social cycle, societies pass from the warrior phase, and after degeneration, conditions get created for intellectuals, usually in the form of priests, to rise and influence and then form the society, dominate the society. They inevitably pass into retardation or degeneration. And out of that, the conditions get created for the merchant social psychology to rise, form the society, and they inevitably also will go into the phase of degeneration. So this model of the social cycle is a powerful tool to understand the social dynamics of the societies, both in the past and right now, here in the present. This particular person, curiously, a hedge fund manager, in fact, the CEO or the founder of one of the world's biggest hedge funds, his name is Ray Dalio, has conceived of a similar model of cyclic development of societies. And he again talks about the rise of a society, this point where it reaches the top and then the phase of decline. And he's gone on to list the points that he believes characterizes these respective phases. So the rising phase, this benevolent phase, characterized by strong leadership, inventiveness, education of the people, strong culture, good resource allocation, good competitiveness, we may say healthy competitiveness, and strong income growth. In the top phase, we may call that the state of pause, we get, in his model, less productive, overextended, it's losing competitiveness, and wealth gaps are being created. And then the decline phase, large debts, the printing of money, of paper money, internal conflicts within the society, loss of reserve currency, that's in relation, let's say, to the country that holds the world reserve currency, currently the US dollar, of course. Weak leadership, and ultimately civil war and revolution. And I was very surprised that a hedge fund manager, one of the great icons of the advanced capitalist system, has actually conceived of this model in a manner that correlates very closely with the Proutist analysis. So what we want to move towards from the Proutist perspective, as articulated by the Prout founder P.R. Sarkar. So Sarkar wanted that the phase of degeneration, of retardation, gets minimized, and that a new benevolent phase of positive development gets initiated as quickly as possible. And once that new phase, you can see here in the middle of the diagram, once that new phase of social dynamics, it also starts to decline into retardation, again shift the social cycle, and minimize that phase of retardation and bring in the new social psychology. So that's the contrast to that sort of systolic flow where there's just this ongoing rise and fall of societies. This is an upward movement of society by moving through the social cycle, the successive phases of the social cycle. So that's where we want to get to. And how are we going to get there? Well, we are going to have to introduce another social psychology in order to do that, in order to minimize the phase of degeneration or retardation in the social cycle, to minimize that and to bring in the next phase of the social cycle. What is that fifth social psychology that P.R. Sarkar advocates? And of course, that is the Sadvipra, sometimes defined as spiritual revolutionaries. So we're going to look at this idea of Sadvipra, because this alternative path for the social and economic development of human society actually requires this fifth social psychology, this fifth social group. So we're going to spend a little bit of time now looking at Sadvipra. Sadvipra, spiritual revolutionaries, possess the qualities of all four classes: laborer, warrior, intellectual merchant. They are spiritually developed. They have the willingness to sacrifice for the good of the whole society. They have unshakable morality. They fight exploitation in all its forms. So this is P.R. Sarkar's response to the inevitable phase of retardation of the social cycle, the phase of decline, the phase of degeneration. We'll look further at that, but I'd like to ask the question, now we have this idea of the social cycle. Question is, in what phase of the social cycle is Africa? In what phase of the social cycle is Africa? So, what sort of answer did we get regarding the question of which Varna might dominate in Africa? Or is it varied across different nations? So
Dada, you can maybe review what people said in the English.
Okay.
And in other languages, people can type in the chat, and Dada Gyanananda can translate for us.
Okay, so our group sort of looked at the impact that colonization had on it, and that it
Yeah,
so
go ahead, Dada.
our group looked at the idea that, our group looked at the idea that the natural flow of the social cycle got interrupted and disturbed by colonization, and that maybe it was in a phase, at least in some nations, in the warrior era, and then the imperialist nations were in the merchant era and started to impose this merchant element into what previously may have been a warrior. So it's, yeah. And then there was also the idea that disgruntled intellectuals were also created in this history and that they are also there. Okay, who would like to speak next? Who can speak on behalf of their group? Oh, they're writing it in the chat, are they? Let's have a look.
The answers are not there in the chat.
Namaskar. So,
Namaskar.
Namaskar.
I can try to say what I heard a little bit. Some believe that there is some type of transitions in the masses, moving from a rigid type of Khatri era towards intellectual era. But at the same time, some comments were made in some groups that these changes are taking place a little differently from country to country. From my looking from outside and from the history of Africa, I know that in Africa, there's many empires in the past which were highly developed and had passed through all these different areas where the priest classes, for example, they ruled in some countries. So even intellectual era came. The kings of Africa were advised by the priests. So they were not just some type of pure Khatri era. So at this moment, as you said, with colonization, we can see this capitalistic colonialism, neocolonialism, and post-colonialism, which is also colonialism, has imposed its will on the masses of Africa, and it has become those who rule the society are capitalists through militaries, through few intellectuals have taken power, and even when they take power, they behave like some dictators. So you can say capitalism and militaries are in league there. Maybe somebody can say and maybe add on or contradict. It will be nice to have different opinions. That is a very good question that Ada made.
Right, thank you.
Ishtadeva, allons-y.
Yeah, Dada, namaskar, Dada, Rabishikaran, namaskar.
Namaskar.
Please, Dada, it may be a challenging question, but what are the criteria to identify a specific psychology in the social cycle?
Great question. Yeah, because I think it's more than just who ends up holding power. So in the case of a warrior uprising that catches power, it need not represent that the actual society has entered at all into a Khatrian or warrior era. So what characterizes that era will be much deeper than just who nominally holds power. So it'll be at the deep level of the masses, at the cultural level, at their sense of what we call in our yoga philosophy the prana dharma. Somehow so it's a much deeper thing than just who holds power or who catches power. And yeah, that's something maybe we could look at another time, unless anyone wants to make a further comment on that point.
Paramashiva, can you speak? Est-ce que tu peux parler là?
Oui,
Oui, allez-y.
oui. Tout à l'heure, dans notre groupe, on a essayé de discuter et j'ai émis mon point de vue. Si vous regardez même actuellement en Afrique, malgré les militaires qui prennent le pouvoir, là, c'est une réaction à quelque chose. C'est-à-dire que on voudrait passer d'une ère à une autre.
Alors, I'll translate for the speaker.
Donc,
Groove, on n'arrive pas à vous écouter ici. Moi, j'ai vu que tu traduisais là, mais tu traduisais pour les gens qui vous écoutaient en français.
oui,
Bon,
oui,
so what he said is
Gourouvat,
that despite the militaries in Africa today taking power, it doesn't mean necessarily that the air is catching, and it signals a desire to change from one era to another.
donc, je disais qu'en fait, ce sont les prémices. Nous sommes dans une période de transition entre la psychologie guerrière et l'ère des intellectuels. Donc, juste une période de transition. Parce que tout ce temps qu'on a vécu ici, pour la plupart des cas, on était forcé de faire de travaux qu'on ne voulait pas. En fait, c'était des militaires, l'esprit guerrier qui dominait. Maintenant, on est en train de réagir face à cette domination des guerriers. Nous voulons passer maintenant vers l'ère des intellectuels. C'est comme ça que nous voyons tout le temps, on parle de l'état des droits, on parle de beaucoup de choses. Donc, on veut se sortir de cette ère des guerriers. Voilà, ça, c'est un peu mon point de vue.
So what he says that the changes which are seen now are clearly a tendency of moving from a Catherine era towards the intellectual era, but it is not yet fully. But you can see in the slogan, in the speeches, people are speaking of a state based on law, state rule based on law, and so he believes is a change into this. I wanted to say something to Ravi Shekaranji. When we decide which van is dominating, isn't it that you have to see which is the dominating force behind those who are holding power and who actually are running this society? So I would say the capitalists are running Africa through buying presidents and paying militaries, and maybe now a change is coming up. If it is really a change, you put a question on the situation of Niger. We don't yet know what are these guys, really, whether they are revolutionaries or they're just opportunists wearing a hat of revolutionary to get the masses. So still most leaders in Africa, those who were type of revolutionary were killed. And those who maintain power were allied with the colonialism type of mind.
Thank you, Dr. G. Great insight. Yeah,
Hello. Hello.
Javon. Yes, go ahead.
Ok. Oui,
Javon.
moi je voudrais, ce que moi je vois, c'est-à-dire mon opinion est que les sociétés qu'on avait en Afrique avant l'arrivée des colons, ce pas des grandes sociétés, c'est des petites. C'est vrai que dans le passé lointain, on avait des empires, et ces empires ont été, c'est-à-dire fractionnalisés en petits groupes de sociétés aujourd'hui, jusqu'à l'arrivée des colons. Et quand les colons sont venus, ils nous ont colonisés. Donc, on n'avait pas de tendance comme ça réelle, tendance qui soit africaine, à proprement dit. Okay. Mais après, c'est-à-dire le départ des colons aussi, il n'y avait pas une société organisée jusqu'à présent. La preuve, c'est aucun pays africain n'a une constitution digne d'une nation. On n'a pas de constitution qui intègre nos valeurs, nos intérêts en tant que peuple africain. Mais aujourd'hui, ce qu'on peut voir, nous sommes dans le cafouillage. Il n'y a pas quelqu'un où, c'est-à-dire, rassembler le peuple et puis établir une constitution qui lie tout le monde, hein, sous forme de nation. Donc, on n'a pas de nation. On n'a pas de nation, pas encore. Donc, il est difficile de déterminer quel genre de choses-là, c'est-à-dire quelle époque nous sommes dans le cycle social. C'est très, très difficile. C'est-à-dire, après le départ des colons, les gens qui ont pris le pouvoir, même si les militaires, ils deviennent capitalistes. Si les capitalistes, ils continuent à être plus capitalistes. Si les, etc., ouvriers, ils deviennent capitalistes. Vous voyez? Donc, tout est déterminé par l'argent. Aujourd'hui, on vit ce qui se passe dans certains pays, en Afrique de l'Ouest, par exemple, et Afrique centrale. Je pense que, bien, on souhaite que ces gens-là aient l'idée de création d'une nation, hein, digne de ce terme. Et donc, c'est une question très, très difficile. On n'a même pas encore commencé pour dire que on est, c'est difficile à déterminer.
Okay, I'll translate a little bit what you said a while ago to those who are in English. So what you said is that though that before is true, it is true that you had empires in the past in Africa, but before the arrival of colonizations, those empires were dismantled already. Some of them were dismantled, we can say, because some were still existing. I know the Empire of Congo was very strong at that time, and it resisted from 1482 to the beginning of real colonization, 400 years of attempt to enter into that continent. But after that dismantlement and the colonization came, there was no real identity as Africa and little identity of nation. So the nationhood is something new, and the idea of a whole continent also is also new. Then he says that during colonization, also that process went on in the same way. And after colonization, those leaders who came into power did not really even create constitutions which would define properly what is a nation, what is a country. So he feels and understands that we are in a big mess because there was no clarity of what we are as a team, as a group of people. And the capitalistic era, which is imposing itself on the whole world, ended up imposing itself on Africa. So he finds it difficult to define what Varna, what class, what social class is dominating the continent. I think your microphone is closed, Dada.
Thank you very much, Dariji. That's great. Really good points made there. Dada Maheshwarananda, would you like to make a comment?
We have time for questions and answers that will continue for another 30 minutes. Is there anything you'd like to say to conclude before we go to questions and answers?
Yeah, let me share the screen again. There's a few more concepts that I'd like to bring in.
Go ahead.
There is a question here of Guruvati asking, did the colonizers really leave the continent? So it's something interesting.
Dada, let Dada finish first,
Yeah.
and then we can answer the questions.
Okay.
Okay. This is looking at a successful Sadvipra guided, we can say, warrior-led society. And the green circle around the red warrior portion is the idea that the Sadvipras, these spiritual revolutionaries, are in place guiding the Kshatriya rulership. So the warriors here have got the guidance of the Sadvipras. Okay, so there's that one. Now, just for the sake of theory, the same would happen if these Sadvipras were leading the transition from warrior to intellectual society. So here the Sadvipras are having that influence on the rulership of the intellectual class. So this is where we want to bring things to, that the Varnas continue to move, the social cycle continues to move, but the Sadvipras are in place to see that the society progresses, that moves positively, benevolently for the welfare of all in the society. And theoretically, again, it's on future point where the transition goes from intellectual to merchant society. Again, where the Sadvipras are in place, then we get the benevolent merchant society. And of course, at the point at which that goes into decline, into retardation, degeneration, then those Sadvipras shift it to the next phase of the social cycle. Okay, so there's that concept which I think we're familiar with. This is simply another way of looking at it. Okay, these slides are really now talking about, in the case that Africa really does have a merchant elite, which is to say the colonial imperial powers, if they put in place a merchant class that in the post-colonial phase took up power, if that's really the case, then we have to assess at which phase in the social cycle we are in any given nation of Africa. And would it necessarily be the case that it's in the phase of degeneration where intellectuals and warriors have been reduced to laborers also? So there's that concept there. And of course, whether disgruntled workers have been created. This, I think, very much applies to the much of the rest of the world. Certainly to the Western capitalist nations, where we really do have a very emergent group of disgruntled workers. And I think following the recent pandemic, that group became bigger than ever. And then we know the dynamic by which the social cycle shifts. It is the alliance between the intellectuals and the warriors, striking merchant power. We call that Shudra revolution. In the case that a warrior class is exploiting the society, then the dynamic of change might be represented like this. It would be intellectual revolution, or rather intellectual, it could be evolution also, against the warrior class, and the possibility arises where the society transitions to the intellectual class. That may have been, for example, I don't know if this is true, that may have been the pre-colonial situation of some nations of Africa. In the case they were led by warrior societies, if those societies had gone into the retardation phase, degeneration phase, then the dynamic to shift that could be represented in this way. Okay, so I think we can leave it at that, and let's go to the questions. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen and let's open it up to the questions. So I see here, did the colonizers really leave Africa after independence? And well, in the light of recent events in West Africa, it's pretty clear that no, they didn't. In the case of a number of countries, and the ongoing presence of France in some of those West African countries, and in that case, maybe we would define that as actually a phase of neo-colonialism, where the financial system, the monetary system continued to be controlled by the colonizing power. And many other very bizarre conditions imposed upon some of those nations. For example, the continued use of the French language, the use of the currency, the training of the military leaders was to be done by the colonizing power. So this is not independence. I think that's what we would call neo-colonialism. Next question here.
If you look farther up, there are 5 questions from Paramashiva.
Oh, above.
Gulabati. You see them?
Above or below?
Above previously.
Oh dear.
What is the fundamental difference between globalization and universalism was the first question.
Okay. Well, the context that we speak about globalization is very different than the context we talk about universalism. So globalization relates to the late phase of capitalism, where it has managed to open up markets globally and impose the trading regimes on a global scale. So at least one interpretation of globalization is that. And it's often happening through these unions, such as the European Union, the African Union, the North American Union is there with Canada, the US, and Mexico. Through vehicles like the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, but where the underlying driver is capitalism itself, is the agenda, let's say, of the advanced capitalist class. Universalism, in the context that we would use it in Prout, is completely the opposite of that. It's a complete different concept, where it's talking about the oneness of all nations, the oneness of all people, the recognition of the existential rights of all people, and not only human beings, indeed extending beyond that. So it's a completely different idea there. Dada, can you read the next question?
Yanananda, there are 2 questions in French from Jai Gopal and from Alma Gluchadan, but they're in French, so you need to translate them into the chat. The next question, Japa puts out the points, some possible characteristics of rule by Varnas. For the warrior era, he says, 1 personality and state organization. For intellectuals, you have belief, ideology, and social organization. And for the capitalist class, you have systems of exchange and economic organization.
Great. Thank you, Japa. That's great.
The next question was, is globalization a change of sentimental strategy by capitalists in order to operate more efficiently?
I think there are sentimental elements used to support the process of globalization. P.R. Sarkar talks about what he calls metamorphose sentimental strategies. And I think this is a very, very important concept today. It talks about the changing, the ever-changing sentiments or sentimental strategies used by the elites to move towards their objectives, the materializing of their objectives. And that relates to globalization. For example, climate change, I think there is definitely an argument to suggest that climate change has been used as a sentimental strategy, irrespective of whether indeed it's happening or it isn't. It has been packaged as a sentimental strategy to support the idea of all sorts of regulations at a global level, which is to say, in support of globalization, and ultimately of the idea of a world government. Now, world government was very strongly supported in Prout and advocated by P.R. Sarkar, but it's nothing at all to do with the world government that is being hinted at today, because the world government being offered to humanity today is a world government dominated by a financial merchant elite, by an oligarchy. And various sentimental strategies are being used to lend support to that idea. But we have to be very, very aware that in the advanced stage of degeneration of the social cycle, all manner of deceptions and manipulations of sentiments will be used in order to advance the agenda of the merchant oligarchy. And what is that agenda today? It is, in my opinion, it is nothing less than the capturing of the planet itself, the establishment of merchant elite rule on a global scale. That is, to me, what the program of advanced capitalism is today. Other people may have very different opinions on that. I accept that. But that's the conclusion I have reached from the type of research and analysis I've been engaged in. Can we?
Guru Charan, he asks, for Africa, the first step is to raise the awareness of the new generation. Even for the creation of a secular society, spirituality is a fundamental basis for awareness, especially in Africa. Otherwise, Africa will always have the same problems and will always remain the prey of the capitalists.
Well done. Perfectly said.
From
maybe.
go
ahead, Dada.
The next question from Jaya Gopal: what does it take for Africa to have Sadvipras And how do we know that this person is a Sadvipra?
Great question, and it's the crucial question to be asked everywhere in the world today. According to those diagrams I was showing, the Sadvipra presence is essential at this phase of history. The only good outcome for the ongoing development of the human species is the creation and presence of Sadvipras in the social cycle, in the society. So your question is perfect. And I think P.R. Sarkar gave many means and ways by which Sadvipras get created. And the previous comment was underlying the importance of spiritual education and the role that plays, moral education, because the foundation of the Sadvipras is morality, are the cardinal human values. And all these can be taught. We need an expansive ideology, which we have, I believe, today. We need alternatives to the current system, social and economic. I think we have those alternatives today, but they definitely need to be taught. So the conclusion I have reached is that our attention has to go towards the creation of Sadvipras as a key part of Prautist strategy. And let's meet together at our local levels and look at what P.R. Sarkar has advised and what other moralist organization and groups are doing, and start building that network. What P.R. Sarkar called uniting the moralists. So I think everything is available for us to effectively do this. We have to do it, and we have to come to a level of organizing ourselves in our collectives with passion and revolutionary spirit to undertake this. And I think it's somehow starting. What I'm seeing, it's starting. Thank you, Dada.
Yadagananda asks, what is the real goal of this present system of domination of the human race? It seems to go beyond mere hoarding of wealth. It seems full spectrum control is the aim. And what would that serve? What would be a perpetual enslavement of the human race by the few? 1% against 99%? But again, on this question.
Perfect question, Dadaji. Really great point. Yeah, it's bewildering, but I think P.R. Sarkar has also given the reply to that in a discourse where he talked about where the mind is dominated by matter, where the focus of the human mind is on matter. It crudifies the mind. And he used the expression, a mind dominated by carbonic pabulum. And he said the natural outcome of that is imperialism. And that's what we're looking at. But it's not the imperialism of the days of the British Empire. It's not even the imperialism of the American Empire, which uses the vehicle of something like 1,000 military bases globally. And some of those military bases are in Africa. and some of the leaders of African nations don't want those military bases in their country. And I think it does come back to the mind that has dominated itself with matter. It has degraded. It's combined with power, and global empire becomes the net result. And it's, we're at a crossroads where either we allow that future to play out, and let's face it, the majority of the world's material resources are controlled by these particular elite groups of people, or we shift that onto a completely different trajectory. I think we actually have the choice here. And for me at this moment, to be able to make that shift requires this selfless group of fearless moralists that we've been calling Sadvipras. So from this viewpoint, the creation of these people, which is to say the creation of ourselves as Sadvipras and others as Sadvipras, becomes a very important priority. And if we can do that effectively, with all sincerity and dedication and mobilization, then I think we will get a lot of, let's say, help in that effort. And I think we will open up a completely new path of development for the human species. Thank you, Dadaji.
Everyone, in the chat, I have put the YouTube channel, Amandla African Samaj. You can see the recordings of the previous lectures, classes in the different languages. Also in the chat is the evaluation link where you can evaluate this class, please, so that we can improve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dadaji. So there's no more questions from anyone, no more comments.
There's always more questions. Aradhana in Puerto Rico asks, how is morality taught?
Oui, oui, je peux poser une question là-dedans, si possible.
Okay, well, in our yoga teaching, of course, we have a very developed set of moral principles, and we have been teaching these moral principles for a very long time, and they can be taught, by someone who is sincerely following those points and trying to sincerely making the effort to follow those principles. That person can teach these principles to other people. But I think it's more than just moral principles to be taught. I think it's really a very integrated package today, and to some extent, we have that. I think in our amongst those teaching Prout and those teaching the spiritual practices, also. However, I'm also of the opinion that society is dynamic and new things are always arising and new ways of doing things better. And that's a challenge for us. How to reach, a mass of people with these teachings, these trainings that we have. It's a very different world today than, even 20 years ago. It's a completely different world. and it's changing rapidly. And we have to keep pace with that so that we can be effective in our role of sharing these liberating concepts and ideas. But I think we know, largely we know what to teach. We have the challenge now to find what are the most effective means to be able to broadcast that to a mass of awakening people. That's the key point. There are a mass of awakening people today. And with every abuse of the oligarchy, of this merchant elite, whether locally, nationally, or globally, with each abuse, it awakens more people up. And that's a great thing. Our time is coming. That's what I see very, very strongly. Our time is coming. And we are going to have to run to keep up with this incredible progressive flow that's happening. Thank you.
Thank you very
Anything else?
much, Dada.
Okay.
And everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Dadaji, and thank you for everyone for joining this evening and supporting. Thank you so much. I hope we can meet
you.
again and talk more.